We are continuing our study of the nature of God, and we are in lesson 7 of that series. I appreciate Jeff Smith covering for me on Wednesday. For the longest time, really didn't intend to be away Wednesday night, and kind of last minute in some ways decided to go ahead and be gone on Wednesday. Somebody asked me if I had gone to the bowl game in Florida, and after last Sunday's lesson, the answer to that is no. I was busy loving Deborah's family, and so if you were here last Sunday morning, you'll understand what that means. If not, grab the CDs and you'll get it after you hear that. But anyway, I appreciate Jeff covering. He covered a good bit of lesson 7, talking about God is spirit and God is holy. I think he said that in a message to me that you're kind of down in that section that talks about how God is holy, is kind of where he left off within this discussion. Now, here, if you'll indulge me for a minute, I had intended to get to a discussion within lesson 7 last Sunday and just didn't get there. How much, and for those of you who were here Wednesday, how much did you talk about, and let me get this up on the screen for you so you can see it as well. But how much did you talk about this anthropomorphism? Did you talk about that much on Wednesday night? This discussion about how John 1:18 says that no man has seen God, but then yet you go into Exodus chapter 33 and you see that scene with Moses, and you see a conversation where God says more about the idea that no man can see my face lest he die, but I'm going to hide you in the rocks, and my glory is going to pass by, and I'll let you see the back of me as that happens. And what happens is sometimes when you look at those two texts, or you look at those two concepts in your mind, you might think, well, is that a contradiction then? Because Moses saw something that was God when he went by there, and I kind of get this idea of anthropomorphism. In other words, the idea of a spirit being like God, or some other thing that really isn't human, that gets described with human features. He used the illustration that we sometimes call the center of a hurricane a what? The eye of the circle, because it kind of looks like an eye when you see it. And so there are times where certain things that aren't human or don't necessarily have physical characteristics like we have, hands, feet, eyes, whatever, that you'll attribute those things to even God at times. No man sees my face, but I'll let you see my back as I go by. And so there's kind of this physical description of a spirit being God. Even though God is not flesh and blood, and no flesh and blood enters into heaven, we understand those concepts. Well, is there a contradiction here? Is the first question then. Does John 18 say it can't happen, and then yet it happens with Moses there in Exodus chapter 33? So I'll pause and let you answer that question for a moment. Is there a contradiction in those two moments? Okay, I see a couple heads willing to go bravely into that right? And so, no, there's no contradiction. Okay, so let's acknowledge that. And I concur with you that shook your head no, the brave ones. And that there's no contradiction between what is said in John 1:18 and what is said in Exodus 33:20 through 23. Now, here's the more difficult question. Why? Why can one text say you can't see him, and yet in another text it appears that at least a portion of God was visible to Moses when God passes by? Then if there's not a contradiction, how do you reconcile them? And maybe that's a greater challenge or a greater question that we have to kind of resolve. Not just, well, it's not a contradiction, let's move on. That's the easy way out, right? How can we reconcile the two? Now, you didn't know I was going to go back to this. If you want to feed into the conversation, you're welcome to. So I'll leave it open for a minute, and then I'll talk to you a little bit about a couple of things that I saw. Okay. And so there's a difference between seeing the glory of God than the actual literal God Himself. Okay, and that I think is probably part of this conversation. Yeah. Okay. So there might be a difference between the idea of God's presence in a circumstance or a situation and His actual person, His actual literal being in relationship to that. And I think there's probably some of that in Exodus chapter 33 because He's trying to describe Himself in human form. And so I think that probably is part of this as well. Okay, and you can see all of these characteristics in trying to figure okay how to reconcile them. Let me give you food for thought as to how you might reconcile these. Maybe slightly different than just saying, well, that's God giving attributes to Himself: eyes, hands, face, back, whatever. I want you to go to John 1:18 for a minute here, and let's look at it. Because the context of thought here is no man hath, and what's the operative word there? Seen. No man has seen God at any time, the only begotten Son, which is in the bosom of the Father, He hath what? Declared Him. So can I ask you just if you only looked at that singular verse, I can understand how somebody might be impressed with the idea, well, nobody has ever seen God physically. No one has ever glimpsed at Him or put their eyes upon Him. But I still feel that doesn't really reconcile very well to what happens with Moses in Exodus chapter 33, because there's a very literal kind of conversation going on. I mean, if Moses is only going to see an anthropomorphism, if he's only going to see some representation of God, why say, number one, you can't see my face because you'll die if you do? Why hide Him in the cleft of the rock, protecting Him from seeing God until He's fully passed? In fact, the text says, in the anthropomorphism part, He says God sticks His hand across Moses' face so that He can get by him first before then He reveals the back, or lets Moses' eyes see the backside of God. That to me seems awful protective if God's just being represented there through some physical characteristic. I don't know that Moses, why does Moses need protected just from a representation of God if God's not present there? I'm just saying that I struggle with that. I struggle with just the idea that that's just a mere representation, because it seems way overboard then of what God is doing to Moses to protect him from what could happen if he sees him in that circumstance. Yeah. Right. Yeah. Yeah. I'm not disagreeing with you. I'm still working on why the protective measures in Exodus 33, because you see God taking on forms at different times, and you don't have the same issues that if you go to Jacob wrestling there in Genesis 32, I believe there's a moment in that narrative where the text says he wrestled with God. And he didn't have to hide his eyes. He didn't have to protect him in any way. He could experience the form that God had taken in that scene without having any protection. In fact, they wrestle how long? All night long. And neither one in the imagery prevails. I think that's not because Jacob's as strong as God. It's because God's trying to educate him. But he leaves that scene. So let me move forward a little further and get you to think a little bit about why I'm taking us down this road. Yeah. So how do how do we reconcile that with John 1:18, where it seems to say that no one has ever done that? Right? That's the implication. If we take that path, that's what John 1:18 means, then maybe we're walking down a path. So here. Okay. And how is he doing that in John 1? Through whom? Through his Son. Through his only begotten. Just back up just a handful of verses. And let's just get an image of what's actually under conversation in John 1. Not just what is said in John 1:18, because we make that mistake a lot, right? We'll take a verse, we pluck it out of where it was actually stated, and we try to say something that maybe it doesn't. Verse 14, and the Word was made flesh and dwelt among us, and we beheld His glory, the glory as of the only begotten of the Father, full of grace and truth. There's that word glory we talked about a little bit ago. And by the way, Jesus we've already studied in relationship to His deity. He is God made manifest in the flesh. So He is God with us. And so could we not even argue in some senses that we have seen God? Men spoke to God when they spoke, talked, walked with Jesus. John bare witness of Him and cried, saying, This was He of whom I spake. He that cometh after me is preferred before me, for He was before me. That's John the Baptist. And of His fullness have all we received, and grace for grace. For the law was given by Moses, but grace and truth came by Jesus Christ. No man hath seen God at any time. The only begotten Son, which is in the bosom of the Father, He hath what? He hath declared Him. The word seen, by the way, here comes from a Greek word, haraho, which I don't always look up Greek words because sometimes I can barely grasp it in English, let alone a language that I don't read or understand without help. But here's why I found this was interesting. The word seen is translated out of many Greek words. Okay, there's lots of Greek words that get translated into English as the word seen. Here's the interesting part. Matthew and Mark never use haraho their entire writings. Neither one of them use that Greek word for the word see or seen or anything like that. Luke only uses it 3 times. That Greek word that gets translated seen in this text. John, in the Gospel of John, uses it 19 times. And 7 times in 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John does he use this particular Greek word. And so 26 times in John's writings, he uses a word that Matthew never used, Mark never used, and Luke barely used. And I kept asking myself, why? Why does John overwhelmingly use this particular Greek word? And so I looked up the word, and it means not just to visibly see something, it means to discern something. It means to perceive something. How do we perceive? How do we discern God according to John chapter 1? By looking to whom? By the Word that became flesh. You grasp not because you saw it yourself, but because it was declared to you. Because the Word came and declared God to man so that we could discern, perceive, understand. And the fact of the matter is, you read John's gospel account, and you read even those three other epistles that he writes, those three, 1st and 2nd and 3rd John. John's whole writings are very centered upon the idea of who is Jesus? What is Jesus? What did he do when he got here? What does he mean to us? He's the one that talks very deeply about God becoming flesh in that whole John 1 context that the others hint around. So here's the point. No man hath seen God at any time, but he's been declared through Jesus. My thought is maybe we're making a mistake trying to pit John 1:18 against Exodus 33 when they're not talking about the same concepts. John 1 is not talking about whether you physically see God, the Spirit, or not. He's talking about you've never discerned, perceived, understood. You don't grasp God on your own. You understand Him because Jesus declared Him to you. You see Him because He's declared Him to you. Let me share one. I see your hand. I'm going to come plus this. Let me finish this flow. Go to 3rd John 1, verse 11. Same Greek word. 3rd John 1, verse 11. Now, I want you to notice something I find interesting about this. So he says, Beloved, follow not that which is evil, but that which is good. He that doeth good is of God. But he that doeth evil hath what? Hath not seen, haraho, has not seen God. Now, here's my point. Why do you use a qualifier if the opposite isn't true? The believers have what? They've seen God. The evil ones have not seen God. The opposite of that is the believers did. The believers did. In what way? Because He's been declared to them through Jesus. Because they have perceived, discerned, understood. They've been able to grasp who Jesus is and chose to become believers in Him based in the testimony of the Word. Here's the point. My point is not that I could walk into heaven right now as flesh and blood, gaze right into the eyes of God and not die. Because I would. If I could even do that, right? That's not my point. My point is, we try to reconcile John 1:18 and Exodus 33 from the wrong viewpoint. We're trying to reconcile them as if John 1:18 is saying it can't ever happen. When John himself says, 3 John 1:11, it can happen when you're a believer. I see Jesus. I see God. He's being declared to me. I can perceive, discern who God is. And John uses that word almost exclusively in order to help us appreciate a different kind of message than just, I'm not coming into the physical contact of God. I guess my why I even went down this road was to just simply say, well, the only time anybody's ever seen God is when He changed His form in some way. That just didn't satisfy me. I'll be honest with you. That thought just didn't satisfy me. It seemed, anyway, not enough, because what Moses experiences seems far different. And in the narrative Jim referenced as well, and even the statement that's made of the Israelites, how they saw God. There had to be a deeper reconciliation than just an explanation away. Yeah. 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 Of that. Right. And my point, Danny, simply is in John 1:18, I don't believe the conversation is about physically seeing God. The conversation is about understanding Him, discerning Him, knowing Him. Light bulb, Jesus is showing you who God is. That's John's thrust of point that he's making. I'm sorry, Bob. I walked away from it for a minute. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, and I agree. The point again I was simply trying to illustrate is that we have to be careful that we miss really what John's trying to say in John chapter 1. And to yank verse 18, not saying you did, I'm just saying some can, to pull verse 18 out and say, well, no one's ever had an experience where they saw any part of God at all, might be an overstating of the case, because that's not really what John's talking about in that moment. He's talking about how it is that we come to know God. And it's not because we were able to discern it on our own. It's because Jesus, who was full of grace and truth, came and revealed it to us, declared him to us. That's how you come to know, discern, understand, perceive who God is. Right, and so that's the point where I'm driving at is that there's one sense that we do see God. We see Him as He's being declared, and we're taught about Him. We're understanding His nature. When we view Jesus and who He is, we get an understanding of who deity is, who God is. No, and that's it. No, He's talking about we get to know who He is, not what He looks like, who He is. Yeah. And really that we have to be careful, Gary, in understanding there are two ways in some senses, two varying ways, and probably more than that in some, but of how we get to know God. When you examine the Old Testament, we get to know God through His direct contact with people. God had very personal and direct contact with individuals under the Old Testament system. And you see Him interact with people, you see Him interact with nations, you see Him very, very directly dealing with man. In the New Testament, He's revealed through His Son. What John say? We had a law, came through Moses, because God interacted with Moses and gave him a law to take down to the people. We had an understanding of God based in that Old Testament Mosaic law, but Jesus has declared the fullness of the grace and truth of God. You don't see God, you understand Him through the Son. And the declaration and the imagery that Jesus allows us to grasp as it comes to understanding who God is. There are two different ways. The Old Testament had a different kind of way that they began to understand who God was. We get a very clear and direct image because Jesus came, walked, talked, lived among men, and left us with an impression of who the Father is. And when we've seen Him, we've seen them both. We've seen them both. I believe he saw the backside of God. I don't know how any other way to describe it. I don't know why he has to be protected otherwise. I don't know why you go. I don't know why any of that happens outside of there's a very real moment with him. Now, again, maybe it's just the personal nature of that circumstance. Maybe I'm not wouldn't be dogmatic about that, and I'm just telling you my own conclusion. I also get this anthropomorphism kind of thinking because God doesn't have a face like we have a face. He's a spirit being, and but sometimes we can explain away things that. I'm not saying you are. Sometimes we can try to explain away something because we're uncomfortable with it, and I struggle with it. But right now, the only conclusion that I can make is that His glory passed by him. What the fullness of God, the glory of God passes by him. He has to hide his eyes with his hand, the description is. But even though he uses, well, let's just think about it. So we say there's the eye of the hurricane, right? And we know that's not a real human or animal eye. But is the eye real? Yes. The eye of that hurricane, even though I'm trying to use some kind of descriptive way to explain it or to help people understand it, doesn't change that the eye of the hurricane is still a real thing. Though God may be saying, you can't see my face, and the spirit being may not have a face in the same sense that a human would. He's saying, I take my hand, and he saw the back. Even though those may be terms to try to just help give some visualization to it, doesn't make the scene any less real. I guess that's the point I'm trying to make. That just because we use a descriptive term like eye of the hurricane doesn't mean the eye of the hurricane doesn't really exist or didn't really happen. Just because God may use descriptive terms to describe Himself in that scene doesn't necessarily draw a conclusion, well, it didn't really happen. And I guess here, and I'll share this with you, and then I'll be quiet, maybe. But my thought is, and I know this, Randy. I know that if I saw the fullness of the glory of God, I'll die, because that's what He said. And so I believe that because that's what He said. He seems to change His thought processes about what He's going to allow Moses to experience there. Because you can't see my face, you'll surely die. Well, okay, but I'll tell you what, Moses. I'm going to set you over here on this rock. And as I pass by, I'm going to sit you down inside a cleft of the rock. And as I come towards you, I'm going to put my hand across your eyes so you can't see me. And then as I get past you, I'm going to remove the hand so that you can see the back of me. I believe that happened. I believe there's a realness about that. I believe there's, in some senses, a literal connection. And my point is, I don't see any contradiction in that. In what passages like John 1:18 say, because John 1:18 isn't talking about seeing the literal presence of God. John 1:18 is talking about how we perceive, discern, understand who God is. And so this sounds odd maybe, I don't need to reconcile those two passages because they're not relevant to one another. That's the point I'm taking 30 minutes to make. We sometimes drive at trying to reconcile those two passages. And we'll talk about things like anthropomorphism, which is fine. I don't know that I need to reconcile them in the way that we try to because they're not really the same. They're talking about two different kinds of moments. The moment where Jesus is declaring who God is, and we discern and understand who He is through the grace and truth that is Jesus. And Moses in a very particular point in time in history, in a very interesting situation where he has led God's people into the promised land but isn't going to get to enter into that scene. There's a very peculiar and particular set of circumstances in Exodus 33 that don't exist in the conversation in John 1:18. And that's really the point I was making, is that an effort to reconcile those two can actually cause us to maybe draw conclusions that don't honor either text because we're trying to use one to explain the other one away and what really happened. I don't know that I need to do that. Yeah, yeah. Even if it's necessary for it to be revealed in some ways of what actually happened with Moses. Yeah. 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 And maybe Bob here's here's why, and maybe you might think, well, Brian, no, what you just did over the last 30 minutes is convoluted and there was something. If somebody walks up to me and says, Brian, there's a contradiction in the Bible. John 1:18 says no man has seen God, and Exodus 33:20 through 23 shows Moses seeing God. That's a contradiction. How far do you think I'm going to get if I say, well, there's this thing called anthropomorphism? Right? Conversation over, right? Now, again, I'm not picking on the guys who wrote the book because I understand why they did that. I felt like I needed a better way to describe the differences between what's happening in Exodus 33 and what's under discussion in John 1. And the deeper I dug into that, the more I began to be convinced that they're not parallel. They're dealing with two different kinds of concepts that are happening. And so they're not contradictions because they're two different conversations. They're two different scenes. They're two different points that are being made in both of those. Yeah. 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 We see God more clearly than ever before when Jesus arrives. Go ahead, Bob. Yeah. 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 Because that was a great fear that Moses had, that God was going to abandon them. Because God basically said at one point, I am. I'm done with them and I'm going to start all over again. And Moses has to beg and plead and urge God not to do that. And there could be a very personal and meaningful reason why God does this with Moses in that scene as it relates to what's happening in that time period, as opposed to what's under discussion in John chapter 1.
Just the way we talked about it, man being flesh and blood, I don't think he can look at like God. God creates so much power to just destroy.
Yeah. And I agree. We're not talking about here the idea that somehow that we see God in His literal spirit being. The point of this discussion isn't about, okay, no, that's okay now. The point is that Exodus 33 and John 1 are two different conversations. Yeah. 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 Make the distinctions. Go ahead, Ed. Yeah. Yeah. Well, what we understand about him is what has been declared about him. And that's the key to this conversation, is what we know about God, what we know about His nature, what we know about His holiness, what we know about His spirit being, what we know about anything as it relates to Him is what has been declared and revealed to us. And in particular, to our generation, or our age, I should say, is He was declared with greater clarity than ever before through the Son, through the only begotten of the Father. Yeah. 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 And these kinds of conversations, in that sense, will be less important to us too, I believe, in that moment.
I was just wondering something. Before Adam's fall, he approached God.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know, I think this was just a show of, okay, this is how the law is here to be veiled. And I was just wondering.
Yeah. It is, and I don't think there's any doubt that the relationship between God and Adam and Eve was far different prior to their sin, in the manner in which He addressed them and dealt with them. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Heard Him. Yeah, lots of descriptive ways, and maybe that's just the reason why we get the descriptions in those forms when there's even those literal moments where there's the presence of God in that scene. Maybe it gets back to some of what Ed was saying. Even if he tried to describe it to us, we probably wouldn't understand it anyway. And so he uses descriptive things like they heard His voice, or they heard Him walking in the garden. Those kinds of descriptive things that are a little easier for our finite minds to be able to grasp. Any other thoughts or comments before I spend the last minute and a half in the actual text that we were supposed to be in? All right, let's jump ahead. I will very briefly talk a little bit about the idea of God's holiness. In Isaiah, and I'm on page 64. If you're looking at your tiny little numbers on the top of your lesson sheets, and they're on the top left-hand side. You probably have to have binoculars to see them, but this idea of God is holy. In Isaiah 6 and verse 3, holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. The whole earth is full of His glory. Within all that discussion of trying to reconcile two passages, do we need to reconcile those two texts? That kind of conversation. We can appreciate the fact, though, that there is something special and peculiar about God. He is not like us. He is superior to us. His holiness is superior to us. And because He is holy, 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 because He is deserving of that kind of reverence and respect, then we do need to be cautious about how we speak of Him, what we think of Him, to not think beyond what we've been revealed and those kinds of things. So, Lord willing, now Wednesday singing. So, Lord willing, next Sunday, when we come back, we'll actually get into this conversation then about the holiness of God. I appreciate your thoughts and comments, and I didn't mean to catch you off guard with that. Again, that was something I had intended to do last Sunday, and we just didn't get there. And then I didn't know how much maybe you talked or didn't talk about that.